The pit bull. It goes under many names. Some people call them pibbles, some people call them pibs, velvet hippos if you will. Sometimes they look like this, sometimes they look like this, and other times they look like this. I feel like you thought I was going to show you a picture of Pit bulls have become some of the most popular dogs in America. They're all over pop culture in movies, TV, music, books. They've absolutely taken over social media. They can be seen all throughout the world as simply companion dogs or working dogs like service dogs, therapy dogs. They're in the military, they're in the police. They've even formed their own heavy metal band. That's actually true, look it up. These dogs are everywhere. But no matter what shape, color, size, or occupation these dogs have, one thing remains consistent. They are the most hated dogs in the world.
Calls to ban pit bulls as pets in the country.
Someone in Maumelle plastered their opinion on pit bulls for everyone to see, asking the city to ban the breed again.
Well, I'll tell you personally, I do not like being around pit bulls. My entire life, I have never felt comfortable around pit bulls, ever.
One of the most feared and fiercely defended dog breeds.
80% of the calls we get pertain to a pit bull.
Pit bull attacks are making headlines.
Last night in Grosse Pointe Shores, during a hearing over a citywide ban on pit bulls.
Her mother, Jennifer, has been reeling, though, for days after she received 3 citations that will cost her hundreds of dollars.
It's simply crazy to allow these animals to be owned.
And when I say hated, I mean hated. There are entire subreddits, Facebook pages, YouTube channels, websites, nonprofit organizations, and advocates who have built their entire career on trying to get these dogs either banned or euthanized or worse. I don't really know how you get worse than euthanized. That was kind of a dumb thing to say. Even just Googling pit bull brings up results like, why are pit bulls so dangerous? How do I survive a pit bull attack? But why? Why do pit bulls have this reputation? Why are they so universally hated? Is it fair? Is it based on science or history? Is it propaganda? Is it just based on humans and our interpretation of the world around us? Is it justified? I don't know. Why are you asking me? I'm a child, a 27-year-old infant. I don't have joint pain. Anyone who says I do is a liar. Before we get into the history and the stigma of pit bulls, I feel like it's really important to nail down a hard definition of what exactly a pit bull is. And it immediately becomes complicated. Yay, isn't this gonna be so fun? You see, pit bull is not a breed. It's actually an umbrella term to describe a bunch of different breeds. Some of the dogs that fall under this are the American Pit Bull Terrier, the Staffordshire Bull Terrier, the American Staffordshire Terrier, and the American Bully, among others. And also, the definition has been changed over time and dogs have been added and taken away. So it does make it really hard to have a firm idea of what a pit bull is. Ugh. All right, just to show some of the disparities these dogs can have, this is Milkshake. He's an American Staffordshire Terrier. He's got that big old pit bull head with not much going on inside of it. He's got this big beefy chest. He clearly skips leg day, and he's got the sluttiest waist in the animal kingdom. This is Blueberry. Now, Blueberry is we actually don't know what Blueberry is. We think that she's a Staffordshire Bull Terrier mixed with something. But as you can see, she's got that pit bull head. She's a little bit stockier, and she got a booty. So, for the purposes of this video, when I say pit bull, I'm talking about, like, you know, pit bulls. The ones that come to your mind whenever I say the word, like the ones you see on Instagram all the time. Why did I spend so much time on this? Says the guy who wrote, is recording, and will eventually edit this video. Now, the book Pit Bull, The Battle Over an American Icon by Bronwen Dickey paints a really good picture of the history of pit bulls. Also, look, I read. Look at all those notes. You've never written this many notes. The modern day pit bull is the descendant of 2 different dogs, the Old English Bulldog and the Terrier. Essentially, in England around 1200, farmers were using these giant mastiff dogs as catch dogs. What that meant is whenever a bull or some other cattle got away from the farm, these dogs would go actually hold the cattle down until the farmers could come collect them and take them back to the farm. This helped prevent them from escaping and also helped prevent people from getting hurt. Eventually, one farmer discovered that if he slaughtered the cattle immediately after they had been held down by a catch dog, their meat was way more tender due to the release of lactic acid. And so bull baiting was born. Because people at that time were bored little freaks, they got really excited about watching these mastiffs hold down these bulls and fight them over a period of time. And I just want to say, I'm not a hater towards bored little freaks. I consider myself a BLF, but if we can't draw the line at torturing animals, what are we doing here? I get indigestion. This quickly became one of the most popular pastimes in England, and around 1600, breeders started messing with the formula on mastiffs and started trying to make dogs with big, wide mouths and strong bases so that they could hold the animals down more effectively and also not get hurt as quickly if they were thrown around by the bulls. And this is where we actually get the Old English Bulldog. It was also around this time that to make it more entertaining, people started shipping in bears and having the dogs fight bears, and this was called bear baiting. It was extremely popular, and according to Dickey, the Queen of England herself would watch the dogs fight these bears and giggle like a schoolgirl. Over time, I guess people started to grow a conscience and start having conversations like, hey, do you think maybe the dogs aren't thrilled about having to fight these bears? And a lot of them are kind of dying. Maybe we shouldn't do this anymore, maybe? And so in 1835, Parliament passed the Cruelty to Animals Act, which banned bull baiting, bear baiting, and the less popular dog fighting. And because everybody follows the law, they listen to it, these practices completely stopped, the dogs were good, and everybody was happy. That's the end of the video. Like and subscribe. What? Oh, it didn't actually stop? It actually became a huge underground enterprise where a lot of people were making money doing it in basements and warehouses. And they also just paid off the cops so that nobody knew what was going on. Oh, okay, cool. I guess we're going to keep going. Eventually, it got way too expensive to ship bulls and bears through the black market. So they started focusing on two different activities. One was ratting, which is where you took two dogs and saw which one could kill the most amount of rats in the smallest amount of time, and then just making the dogs fight each other. But there was a problem, because at this point, the guys running this thing were still using bulldogs. And if you remember, bulldogs were bred to be stockier, smaller, and have wider mouths. And the goal was for them to be able to hold down a big animal for a long period of time, which really wasn't helpful when it came to ratting or dog fighting. So they started experimenting with different breeds, and eventually they bred a bulldog with a terrier, and they got a bull and terrier, or a bull terrier. And this was a huge success for dogfighting, but also they were huge outside of dogfighting all throughout England. Apparently farmers really liked them because they still had a lot of the bulldog qualities, but also they had the terrier agility and speed and ability to hunt. And upper class people liked them because it was said that the terrier in them civilized the bulldog, whatever that means. What's really funny is all of these people had the same dog, but they called it something different depending on their status. So if you were a farmer or a lower class person, you just kept calling it a bulldog because you're like, it kind of still looks like a bulldog and it does all the things bulldogs do. Why would I change the name? But upper class people were like, no, I do not have the same type of dog as the paws. This is a bull terrier. Believe it or not, that accent came out way better than I expected it to. Kind of makes you wonder why I even did it at all. People who were fighting these dogs just called them pit bull terriers since they were fighting in a pit. Super creative name. Good job, guys. Fast forward to the late 1800s. America is absolutely fracturing. Everybody hates each other and they're on the brink of the Civil War. And for some reason, people in England are like, yeah, this feels like a pretty good time to move over there. And so all these people immigrate from England to America and they bring their pit bulls with them. And pit bulls became immediately popular in America, so much so that eventually they just started calling them American pit bull terriers, because that's what we like to do over here. We see something we like and we're like, actually, I made that, that's mine, thank you very much. But these dogs were really popular, and while dog fighting was going on in places like New York, for the most part, they were just like household companion dogs. They were considered really resilient and really easily trainable. Fun fact, there were actually quite a few pit bulls present during the Civil War. One pit bull named Jack ended up joining the 102nd Pennsylvania Volunteers, and at one point, when Jack was captured by Confederates, the 102nd traded a Confederate soldier they had captured just to get him back. Another pit bull that fought for the Union side was a dog named Harvey. He joined the 104th Ohio Volunteer Infantry and was said to behave himself like a true aristocrat. He would sway with the soldiers during campfire songs. He would also sleep in their tents with them to keep them warm, and he would stand by them during their post. He was so popular that a few years later, when they got together at a reunion and took a picture, they had a portrait of Harvey front and center with them because they felt like he should be a part of the picture. The early to mid 1900s saw a peak in popularity for pit bulls. They held a new prominence in American culture, and they were owned by some high-profile people like Helen Keller and Mark Twain. Theodore Roosevelt owned a pit bull named Pete, who was an absolute menace. He chased a French dignitary up a tree, and he bit a naval officer. Keep fighting the good fight, Pete. Dogfighting had become way less popular and was banned in a lot of places. Not that that stopped it. Like, in fact, one guy in New York who was running a high-scale dogfighting operation just said that it was a church now, that he had found Jesus, and believe it or not, that actually worked. It was also at this time that breeders started trying to make different breeds of pit bulls because they wanted ones that were separate from the ones that came from England, and also they wanted some that they could enter in shows rather than as working dogs. And this is where you get the American Staffordshire Terrier and the Staffordshire Bull Terrier, which makes absolute sense because, like, you saw my dogs. They're absolute divas. Pit bulls had a huge moment during World War I and World War II where they were seen as, like, America's dog. People really related to their scrappy attitude, their resilience, their loyalty, and their ability to overcome a difficult past, which is what a lot of people considered themselves as well as America itself. Pit bulls were used in a ton of different war propaganda. My personal favorite is a series of war propaganda made by a guy named Wallace Robinson. Like this one featuring a pit bull wrapped in the American flag surrounded by other dogs that says, "I'm neutral but not afraid of any of them." Or this one from 1915, which shows a pit bull protecting a bunch of kittens wrapped in the American flag. Like, propaganda used to go really hard. Now we just have the army running fake contests on their Twitch account. Just like the American Civil War, there were a ton of pit bulls present in both World War I and World War II. The most popular by far is Sergeant Stubby from World War I. He could anticipate gas attacks, he learned how to salute, and apparently took his own prisoner of war at one point when he found a German soldier who had snuck into the American ranks. After the war, Sergeant Stubby got a gold medal and he met 3 presidents. There's a squirrel out there. During World War II, General George S. Patton had his own pit bull named Willie. Unlike Sergeant Stubby, Willie was not a brave soldier. He would actually hide from loud noises, and he would put his nose up women's skirts and hump their leg. Equally important to the war effort, if you ask me. Pit bulls were so popular and so American at this point that news outlets started trying to rebrand them as the Yankee Terrier. It never took off, but I kind of wish it did. That's just really funny to me, and I don't know why. In between the world wars, pit bulls had also gained a really high reputation because they became huge in Hollywood. One of the most famous was a pit bull named Pete, who appeared in the OG Little Rascals. He was making $21,000 a year and had his own personal valet. That's around $350,000 in today's money, which is fine. That's fine. That doesn't make me want to kill myself at all. This is also the time when pit bulls really became known as great family dogs. They were also said to be really good with children. This is also where one of the biggest myths about pit bulls comes from, that they were known as nanny dogs because people would leave them with their kids. This seems to be based on nostalgia from a bunch of novels and short stories about pit bulls protecting kids. They were not known as nanny dogs. You shouldn't leave kids alone with dogs, any dogs. After World War II and into the 1960s, this is what I would call the most normal period for pit bulls. The hyper-American patriotism from the World Wars had kind of started to wean off, and so they weren't seen as much as a representation of America as much as they were just normal dogs like any other dog. It wasn't until the late 1960s and the early 1970s that the reputation of the pit bull would start to drastically change. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, Aufman, why do you care so much? Why do you care so much that you would yap about pit bulls for
1 hour, 20 minutes.
Maybe you're not. Maybe you just see just how I appear and are glad that I'm spending my time on this and not sending racial slurs to video game voice actors. Also, it just occurred to me that I already showed you my dogs at the beginning of this video. Like, can you guess what side I'm going to be on? The truth is, 6 years ago, I had no idea what a pit bull even was until one day, one of my neighbors brought over this weird, vaguely goblin-looking thing and asked if I would take care of him. And my partner said yes, because apparently she had always wanted one of these little goblin things. And so the next thing I knew, Milkshake, because I mean, like, what else are you gonna call that thing, was a huge part of our lives. As I said, I had no idea what a pit bull was. I just knew that they were somehow vaguely related to DMX, and that pit bulls were dogs and dogs were good, so pit bulls were good. I didn't know anything about them, and particularly I didn't know about their stigma. But I noticed very quickly that I would take Milkshake for walks, and sometimes people would see him and cross to the other side of the street. And I hate to say this, but I'm an introvert by nature, so that would happen, and I was like, this fucking rips. This dog is like keeping people away from me. That's awesome. Then I took him to the dog park for the first time. And Milkshake trotted in and went up to the other dogs, wanted to talk about the political and economic state of the world right now. And some, not all, some other people grabbed their dogs and ran out of the dog park like I brought a freaking kaiju there. And so at that point I was like, what's going on with this dog? And so I did something that no one as impressionable as I should do. I said, hey, strangers on the internet with no verifiable credentials, can you tell me about this dog living with me, sleeping in my bed, seemingly ignoring all the commands I try to teach him, and eating better than some people in other countries? And that's when I found out that what I thought was just a normal dog was actually an unpredictable, bloodthirsty demon straight from hell who would eventually snap, try to kill me, my wife, and everyone I ever cared about, and possibly invade France. Or at least that's what the internet told me. To say the information I found on the internet made me nervous would be a huge understatement. I was terrified of this dog. I started noticing every little thing he did, and it all scared me. I didn't know when him barking or growling was him just playing with me, or when he was just warning me that he was about to remove my face. Every time I took him on a walk, I was so scared that he was gonna break off his leash and do something crazy like maul a toddler or vote for a Republican. Like, I said it, it's out there, we all know. Now we can move on, you can stop watching or keep watching, I don't care. It got so bad that eventually I tried to rehome Milkshake, but then my wife told me that if I did that, she would also be rehoming herself. So we kept the goblin. And then a year later, we went to the animal shelter and we got another goblin, and we named that one Blueberry. And now I have one pit bull in a puffer vest and another pit bull in a juicy tracksuit screaming at me because I'm not making their breakfast fast enough on an everyday basis. So what happened? How did I get past this fear I had of my dogs? Did I do a bunch of research and find out that the stigma against pit bulls comes from a bunch of like media manipulation and propaganda and racial stereotypes? Or am I just stupid? Well, as someone who's had to get multiple tattoos removed, it's the first one, actually. Now, before we discuss why pit bull perception has shifted so harshly, I think it's important to point out that pit bulls are not the first dogs to have a negative reputation, not by far. Like in the time of bull and bear baiting, bulldogs were generally hated by upper class people, and they were considered dumb, violent, and not suitable for families. In the 1870s, Pomeranians were blamed for a mass rabies outbreak, and dog catchers and police officers were encouraged to catch and destroy them anytime they had the opportunity. After the American Civil War, bloodhounds were considered really bad because they'd been used on plantations, they were used by the Confederacy, and they made a notable appearance in the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. During World War I, wiener dogs were seen as the German dog, and they were featured in war propaganda like this one of Uncle Sam choking the shit out of a wiener dog. After World War I, a bunch of American soldiers brought German police dogs, also known as German Shepherds, back to America with them, and they were pretty popular. But as World War II started to ramp up, people started giving German Shepherds the side eye. Also, there were a ton of stories of German Shepherds going around and biting children, which didn't help their reputation. It got so bad that at one point, the Dean of Veterinary College at New York University said that German Shepherds were not likely to be loyal and had an erratic disposition. In the 1960s, several public incidents and their appearance in the media put Dobermans on the chopping block. In the 1970s, it was St. Bernards because of a couple of high-profile attacks and also their appearance in movies like Cujo and The Omen. Unlike pit bulls, though, all these other dogs had their negative stigma during times where there wasn't the 24-hour news cycle or the internet, so bad information passed slower and it dissipated faster. During the 1960s, violent crime was on the rise because of lead in the water or some shit. And high-profile murder cases like Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, and the Manson family, as well as serial killers like the Boston Strangler, had people understandably on edge. All of a sudden, you see this huge spike in big dogs used for protection. In fact, the American Kennel Club registered over 1 million German Shepherds from the years 1965 to 1975. So many people were looking for big trained guard dogs that these people couldn't keep them in stock. And so eventually they started breeding dogs faster, releasing them faster before they were actually ready, and also releasing them before they were trained and giving them to people who didn't know how to handle them. So by the 1970s, you had shelters filling up, stray dogs running around the street, and you start to see these stories about large dogs attacking strangers or turning on their owners. In the middle of all this, a lot of people who were genuinely afraid for their safety started to remember these dogs that had this reputation for being really strong and really violent. And so all of a sudden you see this huge spike in popularity for pit bulls, and they're starting to be owned by people who had never traditionally owned pit bulls. Now, like many problems, the negative stigma against pit bulls starts out with good intentions. A former physicist named Duncan Wright started the American Dog Owners Association because he wanted to investigate puppy mills and their effects on dog and human health. After he found some success in that, in 1974, Duncan Wright decided to move his attention to other dog-related issues because he noticed around this time that dogfighting was starting to gain popularity in different parts of the US because pit bulls had become more popular, and some people remembered that not-so-fun thing that pit bulls had been known for, and so as pit bulls gained popularity, so did dogfighting. Duncan ran into one problem though. People really didn't give a shit about dogfighting. Like I said, people were more worried about human-on-human crime. A lot of people just didn't encounter dogfighting in their day-to-day lives, and the police didn't have a lot of incentive to pursue it. Like in some states in 1974, littering would get you a $500 fine, and dogfighting would only get you a $50 fine. But everything changed when Wright teamed up with the Humane Society. See, the Humane Society had just learned a really important lesson when they were trying to fight lab testing on animals. When they initially tried to bring it to the public's attention, people didn't care. They're like, dude, there's wars going on. I literally don't have the mental capacity to care about whatever you're screaming about. But in 1965, when a family Dalmatian was stolen from their yard and sold to a company that tested pacemakers, the Humane Society was able to ride the public outrage and get the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act signed into law. So they learned a really important lesson. When you want to get the public's attention, find personal stories, make it as scary as possible, and hit the media. Wright and other advocates took this lesson and they did something that would unfortunately have lasting effects on pit bulls. They embellished and kind of just outright lied about dogfighting. Basically, they found or made up the most violent, brutal, gory, outlandish stories they could, and then they went on a huge media blitz trying to push it all out to the public. Wright painted this picture of a dogfighting enterprise that, like, there's no other way to say it, it just didn't exist in reality. Like, he really exaggerated the scope of it. He said that there were over 20,000 individual dogfighting rings with hundreds of thousands of people attending them, and they were all making tens of thousands of dollars every night. When in reality, the number was probably closer to the hundreds, and all these fights were attended by people who were really close with the people running them. Like, remember, even with the low police presence, dogfighting was still illegal, and having these huge arena-style gladiator matches wouldn't really be smart. Wright presented this practice as this ever-expanding social contagion that eventually nobody would be able to get away from. He originally claimed that the main dogfighting hubs were Chicago, Texas, Mississippi, Florida, and Oklahoma. Then he later expanded that list to New York City, New England, California, Florida, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. And before long, just about every state had been listed as a possible hub for dogfighting. While Wright was embellishing the scope of dogfighting, other advocates were embellishing the brutality. They told these stories about dogs being electrocuted or tortured with ice picks, or that they would be given bags of kittens to encourage them during training. And a lot of things just not really worth repeating here. And a lot of these claims seemed to have some validity at the time because they were being reported by the New York Times. Because one of their reporters went to dogfights undercover and apparently was asking so many insane questions about dogfighting that the people running it thought it would be really funny to start telling him all these horrible stories to scare him away, but they didn't know that he was a reporter and that he was going to be pushing this all out to the public. And look, I do want to point out, I don't think these people were doing this out of malice, and I don't think they were intentionally lying a lot of the time. Like, dogfighting is one of those things that is bad enough on its face that it's not hard to believe the worst possible things are going on. And also, I don't want to make it seem like I'm whitewashing dogfighting at all. Like, it's the opposite. Like I said, dogfighting is bad enough. You don't have to exaggerate, and if you exaggerate, it can kind of hurt your case, because the minute something you said is proven to not be true, that puts every claim you've made about dogfighting under scrutiny. For every myth that they told about dogfighting, there were about 10 more about the dogs themselves. They started to reshape what the pit bull was, and it slowly got to where it was no longer a victim of dogfighting, but more of a willing participant. These advocates would claim that pit bulls would go into a frenzy where they would kill everything around them, and that they would kill hundreds of birds and kittens and other dogs during training. They talked about how it had this initial instinct to kill, and that if you poured blood over its head, the adrenaline would take over and nobody could stop it from just tearing up everything in the ring. This also happens to be where one of the most harmful myths about pit bulls come from, and that is the myth of the bait dog. If you've been around pit bulls, or if you've been to shelters and seen pit bulls, you've probably heard about bait dogs. The idea is that you take a pit bull that is violent and ready to fight, and then you find another pit bull that is weaker or won't fight, and you let this pit bull just tear the smaller pit bull up to increase its aggression and increase its strength. And this is just not true. And not because dog fighters draw some moral line at hurting a smaller dog, it's just that it's not practical. As she was writing her book, Bronwen Dickey interviewed Chris Schindler, who was the head of animal fighting investigations for the Humane Society, and he explained to her why the idea of the bait dog just isn't practical. Fighters want a dog to build confidence, and they want him to get his butt kicked a little bit, so that he's going to have to fight through that, Schindler told me. They don't want to let him hurt some dog that couldn't really properly fight back. That doesn't teach the dog anything. The dogs train up the same way human boxers spar with experienced trainers, not the other way around. Dickey goes on to explain that if there are bait dogs being used, it's probably from inexperienced fighters who've heard this rumor be passed on. She also explains that this myth is harmful because it paints pit bulls as either victims or aggressors, when in reality most of them are neither. And like, this myth is still incredibly popular today. I mean, I've been to animal shelters or met people with pit bulls who have a scar or some kind of injury, and they immediately say, oh yeah, that's because it was a bait dog. And like, the shelter workers probably believe it because of this myth, and also it's a great story for the dog that paints it in a sympathetic light, and then the person who adopts it gets to say, look at me, I adopted this really rough dog who came from a really rough situation, look how good of a person I am. But it's kind of just hurting the dog because, one, it's continuing a myth that isn't true, and also there's a lot of dogs who probably don't get adopted because people hear bait dog and are scared of it when that dog probably was never anywhere near a fighting ring. The media blitz about dog fighting was an undisputed success, and it had three major consequences. One, in 1976, Congress amended the Animal Welfare Act of 1966 to ban dogfighting in all 50 states. It also put dogfighting under the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture, who had more resources to fight it. The second consequence is that dogfighting actually spiked. It turns out that when you go on the news and say, hey, there's this huge enterprise where you can make hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's really easy to get into, oh, and by the way, the police don't care at all, some people have an interest. And three, Wright and other advocates in their media blitz about dogfighting accidentally started a moral panic. And this is where we get to talk about one of the main reasons that I think that people hate pit bulls. Let's talk about the mainstream media. The mainstream media has two main goals. One is to protect the interests of whichever billionaire or multinational corporation owns it, and two is to keep people consuming the news. Now, that second goal got a shot of steroids in 1980 with the invention of the 24-hour news cycle. Essentially, Ted Turner, or whoever the fuck, went to his team and was like, hey guys, you gotta talk about the news for 24 hours now. And they were like, if we did that, we would have to either just lie or, I don't know, make stuff up. And Ted Turner was probably like, Or you might have been more like, one thing media outlets have always understood that the best way to keep people consuming the news is to scare them. And so around the 1980s, you see these insane fear campaigns that the news media would perpetuate to keep people consuming the news. So, for example, one guy murders his kid. Actually, strangers are putting razor blades in Halloween candy to attack your kids. A couple kids pull a prank. Actually, Satanists are taking over the entire country. A couple kids have gone missing. No, somebody's going to come and they're going to kidnap your child. And this stuff is insanely successful. Like, try telling someone from that era that this stuff wasn't as bad as they thought it was. They will spontaneously combust. After the amendment to the Animal Welfare Act was passed, people took all that energy they had about dogfighting and they started looking around and going, what the fuck is up with these dogs though? Because remember, like, all these myths about pit bulls had been passed around and the dogs didn't go away. So people didn't know what to do with the energy. And the news media was handed their next moral panic on a silver platter. To kick this off, reporters began repeating myths that had been perpetuated about pit bulls while also creating new ones. And they did this by talking to experts or repeating anecdotal evidence or just, asking questions. This is where we start to see the myths pop up, like pit bulls have locking jaws, and if they bite on you, they can't let go. And they can hold you down with their front teeth and grind you up with their back teeth. Oh, and they can bite with thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. Oh, and remember how pit bulls could be sent into a frenzy and then point in the direction of something and attack it? Actually, they just randomly do that, and they're probably going to bite you, even if it's a pit bull that you have and you're taking care of. The craziest thing about this whole era is that a lot of times, reporters would just repeat what another reporter said without verifying any of the sources. So if one reporter said that a pit bull could bite through concrete or operate a fighter jet, this reporter would read that, assume they did their due diligence, and just repeat it in their reporting. And then another reporter would see what that reporter said, and so on and so on and so on. And I don't want to whitewash the issue. I'm going to be totally honest. Pit bulls had exploded in popularity. There were a lot of stray pit bulls running around, and pit bulls did bite people. And pit bulls did attack some people. And there were reports of pit bulls attacking and were killing people. But it was also happening with a ton of other dogs. The only issue is those dogs didn't have a target on their back at the time. As the media began building up this story of the pit bull as a violent killer, they started finding stories that would help them back that up. So, when a husky kills a kid, that might make the front page news in his town and a few other newspapers. But if a pit bull kills somebody, that's national news. That is front page. That is the headline of every channel. Sometimes, to keep the myth going, reporters would either advertently or inadvertently leave out information to change the context of an attack. Like in 1987, when a retired surgeon was killed by 2 pit bulls. The public outcry was so intense that the state of Ohio declared pit bulls as vicious. Now, what the press conveniently left out is that the retired surgeon was reportedly trying to break into a woman's house after propositioning her for sex. Or in 1987, when a 2-year-old was left unsupervised and he went into his neighbor's yard and he was killed by a pit bull. And that was all over the news, but what a lot of them left out is that the pit bull had been bought and trained to be aggressive and was protecting a marijuana plant. Sometimes, reporters would say that an attack was a pit bull without even verifying what the breed was. And if it later turned out that the dog wasn't a pit bull, they might print a retraction on page 17, but sometimes they didn't say anything at all. Eventually it got to where they would just call them pit bull type dogs. That way they just didn't even have to worry about it at all. And on top of this, they started asking the most random ass people for their opinions on pit bulls and then reporting it as if it came from experts. Like when a police officer in LA said that pit bulls go into a frenzy like sharks and attack everything around them and you can't calm it down. Like, benefit of the doubt, I'm sure this guy had negative experiences with pit bulls, but why are you reporting what he's saying as if he knows what the fuck he's talking about? They accepted quotes from people like lawyers, plastic surgeons, and insurance representatives while ignoring people like animal behaviorists or veterinarians who were trying to tell them that what they were doing was whipping up mass hysteria and dangerous. The circumstances or the facts didn't matter. What did matter is that numerous pit bull attacks were being reported by all kinds of media outlets. Soon, just about every major publication was running front page stories about this dangerous dog that could show up in your neighborhood and attack you at any moment. Headlines called pit bulls things like a time bomb on 4 legs, a national menace, a dog in name only. The media's attitude towards pit bulls could really be summed up by this cover of Sports Illustrated from 1987. This became the definitive image of pit bulls. And this media campaign was super successful at changing public perception of pit bulls. In fact, eventually, every stray dog was a pit bull. Every pit bull was doing something crazy and attacking people. Like, animal control officers would get calls that there were pit bulls ravaging a neighborhood, and then they would get there and it would be a completely different dog just kind of hanging out. State and local governments were starting to ban or classify pit bulls as dangerous. And even people who owned pit bulls that they had had for years and trusted, were taking them to the shelter out of fear that these pit bulls would turn on them. I can't imagine being one of those idiots who would try to give up a dog because they're scared of it. I did that. That was me. I talked about that earlier. I didn't want you to think that I was just being an asshole. This whole thing started to have a weird, like, self-fulfilling prophecy on pit bulls because they would be brought to shelters. The people working in the shelters were hearing all these crazy news stories, so they would separate them from other dogs and leave them completely isolated. Then the dogs would start to act out as an effect of them being isolated, but they would look at it and be like, there it is, that's the pit bull coming out. Similarly, you had people who had pit bulls that they owned and were leaving them out on the street, and these dogs had never lived on the street, and so they would act out, or they would see people constantly scared of them, which would cause them to continue to act out. And it was never, oh, this stray dog is scared. It's, I can see it, that's the pit bull in it, it's coming out. There was also some pretty other important things going on with pit bulls, stuff that would coincide with the media campaign and cause more people to turn against them. It's not fun, nobody likes it, but we have to talk about. It's a new day, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Remember how I said that in the 60s and 70s there were a bunch of people getting pit bulls? Well, one thing I forgot to mention, I didn't actually forget, okay, trust me, this thing is tight. One thing I neglected to mention is that a lot of the people getting them were people of color in low-income neighborhoods. So while upper-class people could get security measures or big trained guard dogs, lower-class people didn't have the same luxury. And remember, at this time, pit bulls were cheap, readily available, and they had a reputation for tearing into anything you put in front of them, which was understandably appealing to people who were dealing with violence from their neighbors or the cops on an everyday basis. The explosion of pit bulls in neighborhoods that featured prominently people of color caused pit bulls to become racialized. Now, for those of you who didn't take one sociology course in college, I know, I gotta be like, top 5 white people of all time, right? See, I'm self-aware, it's okay. Racialization occurs when a certain issue or an attitude or behavior or really kinda anything gets tied to a specific race rather than any other factor like environment. What I'm trying to say is that pit bulls effectively became the black dog, and this meant that people could voice their negative opinions and feelings about black people by disguising it as negative feelings and opinions about pit bulls. And this is your obligatory, just because you don't like pit bulls doesn't make you a racist. I'm sure there are like 14 other things you do that make you racist. That's a joke. Maybe, I don't know. I feel like that's something you would have to search within yourself to know. This video is going to be way too long. This racialization handed the mainstream media a golden egg when it came to their moral panic about pit bulls. The first thing they did was they started tying pit bulls to the drug trade, and this was as America was dealing with the crack epidemic. Pit bulls were called the drug dealer dog of choice. They were described as guarding crack houses, and eventually they were even called accomplices to the drug trade. Dickey points out in her book that between 1986 and 1990, the terms pit bull and crack cocaine followed the exact same spike in popularity in print media. And yeah, I'm sure there were some drug dealers who had pit bulls. The problem is that this is a time where people viewed every single black person as a drug dealer, and then when you see a bunch of black people with pit bulls, you start to think, wow, these drug dealers really like pit bulls. It was around this time that pit bulls stopped being seen as this animal that could just randomly attack you at any time, and they started to be seen as like a weapon being used by bad people. It started to become this weird, like, self-fulfilling cycle where black people, particularly black men, were seen as inherently violent, and pit bulls were seen as inherently violent. So if a black man had a pit bull, the attitude was, well, the black man must be dangerous because he has a pit bull, and the pit bull must be dangerous because he's owned by a black man. You started seeing way more stories about the people that own the pit bulls rather than the pit bulls themselves. And even then, pit bulls started being called things that black people have historically been called, like they started to be called thugs and ghetto. And this idea of pit bulls as a weapon had really bad consequences. Like there were instances where somebody would have a pit bull and they would be stopped by the police, and if they couldn't prove on the spot that they owned that pit bull, it would be taken away from them and a lot of times euthanized. One politician even tried to pass legislation saying that if you owned a pit bull, the police could search your house without a warrant, because the very nature of owning that dog meant you were up to something bad. Likewise, it got to the point to where anyone who even wanted to own a pit bull was seen as negative. There were instances where someone would go to a shelter, and if they showed even the slightest inclination to wanting a pit bull, they couldn't adopt any dog, particularly if you were a person of color, because people assumed that they were going to use the dog for criminal activity. And as the years went on, people who grew up in these neighborhoods and grew up around pit bulls had a really positive view of them. And the attitude towards them started to change, where it wasn't just that they were protectors, they became members of the family, sometimes the only family that people had. And so you saw people really taking care of their pit bulls. You would see pit bulls with these huge chains and these really nice collars and just dripped out as a way to show them off. It was almost like a status symbol for some people. And yeah, there was dogfighting. I'm not going to gloss over that. It was something that happened. But even the reporting about dogfighting became racialized, because there were articles about white people running dogfighting rings, and they painted it as like a coach who really cared about their athlete going out there, and every time their pit bull got hurt, they felt it and they were really sad. But then when they talked about people of color running dogfighting rings, it was these monsters who didn't care what happened to the animals. And in fact, they liked seeing the animals get brutalized because it made them feel strong, and they didn't care how many dogs they had to go through. And once again, I don't like dogfighting. I don't support it in any case. It's just really interesting to see the disparity in the reporting when it came to people's skin tone. As hip-hop music really started to take off, you saw people who had grown up in these areas bringing stories about it with them into their music, and so their pit bulls came with them. You started to see pit bulls in music videos, on album covers, and a lot of times featured in the lyrics themselves. And this continued to solidify pit bulls as a staple of black culture, while also having more white people see them prominently featured with people of color and going, I'm uncomfortable. As pit bulls continued to become racialized, it's also suspected that people started using pit bulls as a way to get rid of people they don't like. You started seeing more legislation being passed banning pit bulls, and you also started to see more rental places banning pit bulls. And so that meant you either get rid of people you don't want living there, or you get rid of this dog you don't want living there. So either way, it's a win-win. And you know, we have to talk about, if you look into it, the dogs that face legislation and dogs that are typically owned by lower class people, if you took those two and you tried to make a Venn diagram, it would mostly just be a circle. Like if you tried to ban golden doodles tomorrow, you would have a bunch of really well-off people with resources able to fight you tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. But if you don't have those resources and someone tells you, hey, you can't have this dog anymore, you have to take it, which means you don't keep the dog, or you have to move, which a lot of times isn't something they can do. There's also just an inherent attitude that a lot of people have, including myself at times, where you see someone with fewer resources and they have a dog, and you automatically assume that they can't take care of that dog the same way that you would. And then you start to retroactively view the type of dogs that those people get as negative, because that's the association you always see. Just because someone can't afford to get their dog a puffer jacket or a juicy tracksuit doesn't mean that they care about their dog any less than you do. In fact, it's been shown many times that less well-off people, and particularly homeless people, will put the needs of their dogs ahead of their own. Throughout the 90s, pit bulls continued to grow popular in communities of color, and they also started to pop up in other different communities. Like there was a whole section of hyper-masculine tough guys who wanted to get pit bulls specifically because of their reputation. And you started to see breeders manipulating their practice and making these large mutant pit bulls, basically trying to make these dogs look as don't fuck with me as possible. What's ironic is that These giant, irresponsibly bred pit bulls have kind of become the face of pit bulls in the anti-pit bull community, but that's not the kind of pit bull that fighters would even use. When you make it look that big and that deformed, it doesn't have the qualities you need from a fighting dog. Basically, at this point, you either avoided pit bulls like the plague, or you got a pit bull for the same reason people want to own lions or poisonous snakes. It wasn't all bad though. Like, there were a ton of people on pit bull's side trying to fight to repair their reputation. You see a ton of pit bull rescues open up at this time, and a ton of pit bull advocates trying to fight with science and studies to show that they're not what they had been perceived as. But these people were kind of just yelling into a bunch of noise. I think that's probably how my wife feels most of the time. As we made it into the 2000s, the internet became a common staple in many households. Now, one of the things that the World Wide Web did is it allowed morons to go on there and spread a bunch of information even though they didn't have any credentials. I'm in this picture and I don't like it. The fight against pit bulls moved into the digital age, and before you knew it, you had websites, web forums, social media accounts, and a ton of people pushing really bad information about pit bulls, but this time they were able to reach way more people way faster. And you start to see a lot of the myths that had popped up about pit bulls in the 80s start to reoccur and get more popular now, because as it turns out, the people who grew up during that time hearing all these things about pit bulls didn't just forget about them when they got older. But by the mid-2000s, a couple of different things would happen that would completely change the discussion of pit bulls for the next 20 years. So what the hell is actually going on with these dogs though? All right. We have officially made it to the part of the video where I get to pretend that I know anything about science or statistics, the subject that I famously made a C- in college. All right, let's start with the pit bull's bite. Pit bulls do not have locking jaws. If they bite onto something, they are completely capable of letting it go. Sometimes if they're not trained to, they might not want to and they'll hold on. You know what other breeds of dogs do that? Like literally all of them. It's called tug of war and they love it. Pit bulls also do not have the ability to hold you down with their front teeth and grind you up with their back teeth. I would like to remind you that these are dogs, not wood chippers. When it comes to how dangerous a pit bull's bite actually is, it gets really complicated. There are a lot of studies you'll find that are kind of bullshit just based on the methodology. One, there are a ton of issues with bite reporting. Don't worry, we're gonna get to it. But two, in the 80s, a bunch of plastic surgeons got together and wanted to prove that a pit bull's bite was inherently dangerous. And so they started doing things like knocking out any bite that couldn't be tied to a specific breed, so you had a tiny sample size. And then a lot of the time they would just look at a bite and say, oh, I can tell by looking at it that came from a pit bull, which multiple studies have shown doesn't really work with bite identification. In fact, bite forensics don't really work that well with humans either, which is why you're seeing them less and less in court. One point that I will concede here to the anti-pit bull people is that some models have shown that a pit bull's bite can be more dangerous than other dogs, specifically because they got that big old mouth, which makes sense because they're able to bite more of you at a time. But this also shows up in other dogs like bulldogs. But the idea that a pit bull can bite down with thousands of pounds of pressure more than other dogs just isn't accurate. Multiple studies have shown that the average force of a pit bull bite is less than that of even a German Shepherd. It's kind of hard to test a dog's bite strength in the first place because dogs bite for so many different reasons, and it's hard to know during a test if the dog is biting as hard as it can. In just about every study I found about dog bites, the people running the study agreed that a dog's size matters way more than the specific breed. One of the most popular statistics I see about pit bulls goes something like this. Pit bulls make up 6% of all dogs in America, but they make up 66% of all dog-related fatalities. And on its face, yeah, that's a really scary statistic. But like most things about pit bulls, if you chew it up a little bit, you'll realize that it's not as black and white as it may seem. For starters, only 30 to 50 people die every year from dog attacks, and there are like 8 billion people in the world. Like that's less than people die from car accidents, falling, and insects. So you're already dealing with a really tiny sample size. Like that would be trying to decide if Oreos or Pop-Tarts are more dangerous and only studying people who've died choking on them. And I will say, like, people dying from dog attacks is objectively bad. Like, I totally get why we need to address this. But the idea that 66% of people are killed by purebred pit bulls is just not correct. In fact, since 2016, over 80 different dog breeds have been tied to fatalities. To know what's going on here, we really have to get into the many issues with bite reporting. See, the vast majority of the time, when someone's bitten by a dog and it gets reported, the breed is determined either by the person who got bit or by eyewitnesses who saw the dog. And you're probably thinking, yeah, that makes sense. Like if a pit bull bit me, I would know that. And if a chihuahua bit me, I would know that. Well, let's talk about it. In 2009, a study was held at 4 different animal shelters in California. Researchers took 20 different dogs and had the shelter workers identify their breed just by looking at them, and then they ran a DNA test to confirm what the breed of the dog actually was. The shelter workers got the breed wrong almost 88% of the time. When they did a follow-up study with 120 different dogs, the shelter workers identified 55 dogs as pit bulls that had no pit bull DNA, and then they missed 5 dogs that actually did have pit bull DNA. In another study, 900 different professionals who worked in dog-related fields, so think veterinarians, trainers, behaviorists, groomers, were shown 120 videos of different dogs and asked to identify their breed just by looking at them. Out of 120 dogs, they could only reach a majority consensus on 7, and they got all 7 wrong. One study even found that 60% of dogs identified as pit bulls had 0 pit bull DNA at all. And out of the 40% that did, less than half of them had more than 50% pit bull DNA. And look, doctors are doing other things. Like, they're busy people. So if you get bit by a dog and you say, I got bit by a pit bull, the doctor's gonna be like, well, I mean, I feel like you would know, so yeah, I'm gonna put down a pit bull. And most of the time, there's no follow-up to see what the breed of the dog actually was. This also ties a lot into media perception, where people hear about these crazy dogs that are attacking random people, and if they get attacked by a dog, they automatically assume it's this dog that they've heard about all these years. Also, there are a ton of dogs that look a lot like pit bulls. Also, there are a ton of people who own pit bulls that aren't actually pit bulls. Like, remember, most of the time, shelters identify dogs based on just looking at them, and that's how they determine what breed it is. And they don't have the resources or time to do DNA tests. And so if they look at it and it looks like a pit bull, that dog is a pit bull for life. And then anything that dog goes on to do reflects back on pit bulls when it might not have any pit bull DNA at all. Remember at the beginning of the video when I said, we actually don't know what Blueberry is? Blueberry might not be a pit bull at all. I'm not going to check because that takes time and money and effort, and most publicly available dog DNA tests are kind of bullshit. Anyway, as of 1998, the CDC doesn't even record breed in their bite reporting. Also, the 6% to 66% statistic is already kind of weird because the 66% seems to be encompassing bites from all pit bulls, including mixes, but that 6% is only purebred pit bulls. Because if you were to count pit bull mixes, they would actually account for closer to 20% of all dogs in America. It's almost like they're trying to attribute the most amount of deaths to the smallest amount of dogs. And for what it's worth, even the reports that have suggested that pit bull bites have gone up over the years may not be as much of a gotcha as people pretend they are. The American Veterinary Medical Association argues that the increase in pit bull bites we've seen coincides with the increase in popularity of pit bulls. And this is something that happens every time a new dog becomes more popular. And even in the past few decades, other dogs have jumped ahead of pit bulls when it comes to reported bites. Is this even remotely entertaining anymore? Just some guy reading off statistics? I mean, I put way too much into this, so we're gonna keep going. All right, we have made it to the good stuff. Are pit bulls inherently aggressive? No. There have been so many studies, papers, surveys, and analysis that have shown that pit bulls do not show any more propensity toward aggressive behaviors than any other dog breed. In one survey of 33 different dog breeds, pit bulls scored lower than average on human-directed aggression. I will say they scored slightly above average on dog-directed aggression, but it was well within the normal range and it was below wiener dogs. As of 2023, when tested by the American Temperament Test Society, the American Pit Bull Terrier, American Staffordshire Terrier, Staffordshire Bull Terrier, and American Bully all scored over 85%, which is better than Golden Retrievers. And speaking of Golden Retrievers, in one study from the Journal of Veterinary Behavior, 415 dogs were tested to see how they respond to human, dog, and environmental triggers. The study found no significant difference in the behavior between dogs who are often legislated against, like pit bulls, and their control group, which consisted of golden retrievers. One woman named Anna McNeil ran her own study where she followed a set of shelter dogs before and after they were adopted. Out of 82 dogs, 42 being pit bulls and 40 being different breeds, only 4 of the pit bulls were unable to be adopted due to aggressive or fearful behaviors, while 12 of the other dogs couldn't be adopted for aggression or fearful behaviors. She did follow-up surveys with the owners to see how they reacted to stimuli that can often show aggression, and the pit bulls showed no difference from the other dogs. And in their care, the only thing she found is that people who adopted pit bulls were way more likely to let the pit bull sleep in the bed with them. Which isn't helpful. I thought it was sweet. So what's going on here? I mean, pit bulls have been bred to be aggressive, violent creatures. It's literally in their DNA, right? Well, and this is where I can already hear people yelling at their screen. I just want to say, put it in the comments. That's good for engagement. We still don't have a firm grasp on just how much a dog's breed affects their individual behavior. And I know, we've all heard that old adage, pointers point, retrievers retrieve, Pomeranians pomerane. And look, I'm not qualified or smart enough to comprehend or explain the complexities of dog genetics. And it seems like there's a lot that even the experts still don't fully understand. From what I understand, dogs are predatory animals, and they all follow a similar pattern when it comes to hunting something. And throughout time, breeders have selected dogs that are better at certain aspects of the hunting process and continue to breed them to be good at those specific things. So while a golden retriever may be more likely to chase something or carry something in their mouth, that doesn't mean that they come directly out of the box knowing how to go retrieve something and bring it back to you. One thing that really surprised me is that even the case of something like seeing eye dogs, where the environment and the breeding and the training is so strenuous and controlled, the highest success rate I was able to find is around 70%. One study at UMass Chan Medical School found that breed only contributes to around 8% of an individual dog's behavior. And when they were studying genes, they found that genes that are tied to specific behaviors aren't exclusive to any one breed. Even characteristics that almost never show up in particular dog breeds like howling still showed up around 3% of the time. Apparently physical characteristics like their color or their coat type are way more likely to be tied to breed than any individual behavior. Also, one study found that golden retrievers are way more likely to be perceived as friendly because they've got the floppy ears and that kind of dumb look they have. That's not what they said, that's my words. And so as humans, we look at that and we're like, oh, that dog's friendly purely based on appearance, not because of anything that the dog has done. Now, I should say, there have been a few studies that were able to tie aggressive and fearful behaviors to specific breeds. And in 2 of these studies, they both found that smaller dogs are way more likely to show aggressive behavior than bigger dogs. One study of Finnish purebred dogs found that smaller dogs were way more likely to be aggressive, but they also argued that factors like their environment, their age, and also where they're living had way more to do with aggression than their individual breed. One study led by a guy named Isaín Zapata found that wiener dogs consistently showed more signs of aggression than any other dog. And so he did a follow-up study and tried to figure out what was going on, and he found that one gene that they thought might be tied to aggression was really close to another gene that accounted for a wiener dog's tiny legs. And so when you copied the tiny leg gene, you might be bringing the aggressive gene with it. But even Zapata, in an interview with the Science Versus podcast, argued that
so if you're a very small dog, everything is giant around you. You go to the doggy park and you're going to be playing with giants.
And all this becomes even more complicated when you realize that aggression isn't one behavior. It's actually a series of reactions to different stimuli that dogs can have for different reasons. So even if a dog were to have a higher likelihood of showing aggressive behaviors, that doesn't mean it's going to automatically happen. And the idea that any dog breed is just intrinsically aggressive isn't realistic. Also, I'm kind of cheating here anyway, because at the end of the day, none of this might even matter. Because are you ready for a hot take? Pit bulls were never bred to be human aggressive. If I had to give one compliment to dog fighters, gun to my head, it would be that over the years, they have kept really good records. And one thing that is consistent every time is that any dog that shows any sign of being aggressive towards humans is gone. You have to remember that these dogs are around a lot of people. They have trainers, they have handlers, and when they're in the pit fighting, they have a human with them. Having a dog like this show any signs that it can turn on its humans is not safe for that environment. Even the dogs that were trained to be violent and fight other dogs were trained and bred to be friendly to people. They're not these unpredictable time bombs. I mean, unfortunately, they're in this weird relationship where they have a lot of love and affection and loyalty to their trainer, but they're also taught to go ballistic on their fellow dog. And it's really sad and it's really warped. I don't like it. What you find when you research pit bulls and their behavior is that they fit right in the middle of all the normal parameters you want from a dog, with them being above average in a lot of different categories. So yeah, there's a lot of theories and myths and anecdotal. So yeah, while there's a lot of theories and myths and anecdotal stories about pit bulls being these violent, aggressive killers, the science just doesn't back it up. In 2007, NFL quarterback Michael Vick was arrested for running a large-scale dogfighting operation in Virginia. Man, I want to beat the shit out of him so bad, but he's so big, and I haven't been in a fight since. There are just a ton of not fun details about what Michael Vick was doing to these dogs. And honestly, it seems like he heard some of the stories from the 70s and used it as a guidebook. Because of his success in the NFL, this story was huge. Dogfighting got attention that it hadn't seen for like 20 years, and everybody was watching these dogs, and everyone expected that these dogs would just be euthanized. And even PETA said that they had no chance of rehabilitation. Hey, everyone hates PETA. We can all agree here. But there were a few pit bull rescues and a few animal behaviorists who wanted to give these dogs a shot. In the end, 35 of these dogs were able to be successfully rehabilitated and put in new homes, and one of them even went on to become a therapy dog. This whole story is laid out in The Lost Dogs, Michael Vick's Dogs and Their Tale of Rescue and Redemption by Jim Gorant. This is a fantastic book that I will never be reading again. Fun fact, this book stems from a front cover story of Sports Illustrated, the same publication that ran this story 20 years before. For the first time, people are starting to renegotiate their preconceived notions about pit bulls. Remember, these weren't just pit bulls. These were fighting pit bulls. These were the worst of the worst, the ones who had the worst reputation. And people had a lot of expectations for what they would be like and how they would act. The idea that any of them would go on to be able to live in a home and that one of them would be a therapy dog was insane. It also allowed people to put specific dogs in their faces to these stories they'd heard, and it started to make them see the dogs as the victims again. This all had people going, you think maybe we were wrong? You think maybe we got it wrong? Maybe these dogs weren't thrilled to be in this and doing all this? And this ignited a fire of support that pit bulls hadn't seen for about 30 years. And at this point, if you're thinking, listen, people are good at heart. People just want to get to the truth and they want to have good conversation. And at this time they had the internet, so they had access to a lot of good information and a lot of good research. And I'm sure these discussions were super productive and good faith. I want to tell you the same thing that I say to myself in the mirror every morning. Idiot! How could you be so wrong? How could you be so wrong about everything? Please subscribe. Just like most discussions on the internet, the argument over pit bulls became immediately chaotic, aggressive, toxic, and full of bad information. Just like my sex life. This is also around the time that social media was really starting to take off, and these social media sites were trying to figure out, how do we keep people on our websites? And at some point, they realized if we get people really pissed off, they'll stay on here and they'll click and comment all day long. So you started to see pages pop up on like Facebook where one person would say, pit bulls are evil and they're gonna kill you. And this person would be like, no, pit bulls are fine. They're fantastic dogs. And these people would just fight. Every comment section became toxic. People were being really aggressive toward each other and using personal attacks. And there was no science or nuance involved. And this is still one of the hottest topics on the internet. Like over the past few years, the fight for pit bulls has exploded. It's all over Reddit, it's all over YouTube, it's all over TikTok, rest in peace, maybe, I don't know. I'm filming this as they're trying to figure all that shit out, so we'll see what happens. And even my family Thanksgiving. It seems like everyone on the internet wants to argue that pit bulls are either evil or perfect. You can even see how divisive they are if you just Google pit bull and Google's AI tries to figure out what the fuck to tell you about these dogs. And don't think that the mainstream media has decided to bow out now. Like, they are still completely involved because pit bulls are a hotter topic than ever, and they are still using it to get eyes. But now it's even worse because whereas before, you could scream at the TV and they couldn't hear you, now they have the comment section. So they can run a story about pit bulls and then say, hey, what do you think? And then people start fighting in the comments, and that's engagement, baby. And the levels they have resorted to keep pit bull stories in the news at sometimes have just gotten frankly pathetic. It's gotten to the point to where news organizations will report on pit bull attacks when a pit bull hasn't even made contact with anyone. Like in 2006, when a man in Texas had a pit bull lunge at him, but it was described as a full-blown attack. Or in 2009, when stories of pit bulls mauling trees started to pop up. And once again, other stories show us that these media outlets love reporting a story before they have all the information. Like in December 2008, an 80-year-old woman was found dead in her home. She had 2 pit bulls, and when they found her body, they found scratches and bites all over her body and assumed that the pit bulls had killed her, and that's what was reported. But later, when the coroner looked at her body, they found that she had had a heart attack and that all the bites and scratches had come from after she had died. You think there were a bunch of corrections? Even in the case where there is a full-on confirmed pit bull attack, they will still leave out context. Like in 2005, a young girl was killed by 2 pit bulls. It was reported as 2 well taken care of family dogs who turned on their owners. They even asked the owner if her dogs were aggressive and if they were taken care of, and she was like, yeah, they're fine. Like, the reporters went to her and said, hey, I know you're kind of being investigated right now. Would you like to admit to the camera that you abused these dogs? And she was like, no. And they're like, all right, sounds good to me. When the dogs were euthanized and then they looked at their stomachs, they found nails, cardboard, and rat poison. It was also confirmed that the dogs had been isolated in a basement, not able to see anyone, and that they hadn't been fed for weeks. Even as recently as February 2024, a man was killed by his pit bull, and all the stories were about how a pit bull turned on this man. And they conveniently left out that this man was being investigated for running a dogfighting ring. And the most frustrating part is that they still get information from experts who don't know what they're talking about. In 2007, a website developer named Colleen Lynn was bit by a pit bull when she went on a jog. After this, Colleen developed a website called dogsbite.org. And from what I understand, it started out as a hub for information about dogs and dog bites while also being a support network from other people who had been attacked by dogs. And I think this is, hot take, a good thing. I think it's really admirable to take something that happened to you and use that energy and use your skills to try to prevent it from happening to other people while also offering support to people it has happened to. The problem, from what I can tell, is that over the years, the shift has focused from stopping dog bites to attacking pit bulls specifically. Like, just to give you a little glimpse into how they operate their website, the KC Dog Blog pointed out that one year they gave this dog warden their prestigious Dog Warden of the Year award because he had advocated for banning pit bulls. What's odd is that dog bites went up 25% in his jurisdiction that year. The website uses cherry-picked data, studies that are either highly scrutinized or have been completely debunked, statistics like the 6% to 66%, anecdotal stories, and stories from the mainstream media, which, see the earlier sections to see all the issues with that. The website will also periodically list certain dogs like boxers as pit bulls so they can beef up their numbers. And let me just say, I get it. Like, if I was bit by a pit bull, I would probably have a lot of animosity toward them too, but you can't use bad science and you're not helping the problem. And there's no two ways about it. This website gets toxic as fuck. People will post pictures of dead dogs. They will wish violence on pit bulls and their owners. They've used homophobic slurs. They call anyone who tries to present any kind of conflicting information science whores, which unironically does kind of go hard. And they'll also accuse them of working for the big pit bull lobby. I don't know what that is. I would love to get a check though. And sometimes they'll even victim blame people who've been attacked by dogs, which just seems really counterintuitive to what they say they're trying to accomplish. And you might be thinking, okay, Who cares? Who cares what some lady on the internet is saying about your dogs? Apparently the mainstream media, because many stories about pit bulls will have dogsbite.org listed as one of their main sources. And many times they don't even talk to an expert from the other side or present any conflicting information. And I get it, like dogsbite.org has a lot of scary statistics and a lot of scary looking studies that make for a great story, but they don't hold up to scrutiny. And all of these problems seem to be really prevalent in anti-pit bull groups. And I want to say, once again, if you've been attacked by a pit bull, I get it. I get not wanting them around, but they rely on bad science, anecdotal evidence, personal attacks, and just lies. And also, this isn't just a one-sided problem. I firmly believe that one of the main reasons people still hate pit bulls is that this part really isn't going to be that interesting. This is kind of just me bitching about my own side. When I got Milkshake, of course, I saw all the people talking about how bad pit bulls were. But I also saw a bunch of people arguing the exact opposite. And it felt really quickly like I hadn't gotten a dog, but that I joined a side in some binary argument. Like it felt like I was making a statement rather than getting a pet. For every forum I found saying that pit bulls were vicious and wanted to kill you, I found another one saying, oh, pit bulls are innocent little angels and they wouldn't attack you if they had a gun to your head and you were covered in bacon grease. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those both sides are equally bad people. Like I definitely am on his side, but a lot of times the people on my side do really stupid things. A lot of people, including myself before working on this video, seem to think that having any kind of nuanced discussion about pit bulls means that you're giving points to the anti-pit bull side. So they paint this picture of pit bulls as these perfect little angels, and anything that doesn't paint them in that light as bad faith propaganda. They will use bad statistics, they'll misinterpret science, they will hold on to lies and myths. I swear to God, they won't let go of the nanny dog thing no matter how many times people point out that they're wrong. They'll victim blame and even gaslight people who have had bad experiences with pit bulls. And like, I'm on your side, but when you do stuff like this, you make it harder for the people who are trying to use evidence and science to back up why we support these dogs. Because when you paint these dogs as these perfect things that never do anything wrong, it makes it so much more difficult whenever a pit bull does do something bad. And it's infuriating. And the worst part is, you don't have to do any of this. The science is literally on our side. You just have to access it and learn how to disseminate it. I have to point out something that I, Aufman, am not proud of. You see, I'm a hypocrite. I say that because at the end of the day, I didn't keep Milkshake and go on to get Blueberry because I read a bunch of studies or talked to a bunch of experts or even because my partner threatened to leave. Okay, I mean, it was a lot of that, to be honest. Honestly, I kept these dogs because over time, I kind of forgot that I was even supposed to be scared of them. These dogs are goofy as hell. Like Milkshake's afraid of ducks. Blueberry will get so excited that she starts zooming around and she doesn't stop until she runs into another object. They both get so excited whenever we take out sweaters for them to wear, and sometimes they do things that are just so dumb that I genuinely fear for what their life would be like in the wild. They are funny and energetic and happy and loyal to a fault. When I'm sick, Blueberry will literally not leave my side. Milkshake will bring toys and try to force them into your hand until you play with them. They are curious and mischievous and stubborn, and seeing their personalities come out over the past few years has easily been one of the best things to ever happen to me in my life. But what I like about them the most is the changes that I've seen come out of myself because they're in my life. I've become more patient and curious, and they've taught me to focus on the small little moments, like taking a nap on a Saturday, or taking time in the afternoon to throw the ball, or stopping at every single mailbox when we're on a walk, or checking out every single bird and squirrel. What I'm trying to say is that what I love about dogs, and what people generally seem to love about dogs, these pit bulls have in spades, which makes sense because pit bulls are dogs. When I first started working on this video, I was positive that I knew what the thesis of it was going to be. These dogs are little angels. They've never hurt anybody. I would let these dogs perform surgery on me tomorrow. But as I've worked on this video, I've realized that I've been missing the whole point. Pit bulls are dogs. They aren't any crazier or more violent or better or special than any other dogs. When we try so hard to constantly prove that they're different in one way or the other, we're neglecting the fact that they're just normal dogs. They're normal dogs with their own abilities that can be embraced and trained to be great companions, or warped and twisted to make them violent. And our attitude toward them is all about our own perception. Over the years, pit bulls have been burdened with a reputation they didn't earn and put on a pedestal that they didn't ask for. By trying to analyze these specific dog breeds and try to prove that they're special one way or the other, all we do is move the target to a different breed. And we can already see this because people are starting to turn against chows. And I know when I brought up the study that showed that smaller dogs tend to be more aggressive, somebody out there was like, well, that makes sense because I got bit by a fucking chihuahua. You're missing the point, you're missing the point, you're missing the point, you're missing the point. There's a ton to be said about why people choose a specific dog or a specific breed. It seems to be a reflection of how we see ourselves or how we see the world around us. Look, dogs are amazing. We've had this relationship with them for a few thousand years, and we've bred them and trained them to be workers and companions and members of the family and our best friends. But sometimes we get so into anthropomorphizing our own dogs that we forget that at their core, dogs are animals. And sometimes animals do things we don't like. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, bite statistics are really complicated due to not having a central reporting apparatus, issues with breed identification, and a whole slot of other things. But what we do have are a lot of studies about why dogs bite. When dogs bite, a lot of times there is a reason. Sometimes there's context we're missing about the treatment of the dog. Sometimes dogs have injuries. Most of the time, it seems like dogs bite because the entire time they've been sending us signals that we're not good at picking up on. And this makes a lot of sense because when you look at individual bites, most of the time it's a toddler. You know, those tiny little humans that can't pick up on social cues, much less understand what a dog is trying to tell them. And the risk goes way up when the kid is unattended. But also, sometimes dogs just bite. Sometimes there's a neurological problem. Sometimes they just feel scared or threatened. And when dogs bite us, it feels personal. It feels like this deep emotional betrayal because we like to think that we're different, or our dogs are different, or our relationship to our dogs are different. And when a dog bites us, it breaks that illusion. I think we have such an attachment to our dogs that we want to find some kind of underlying reason so that we can say, oh, my dog would never bite. My dog wouldn't bite because it's not this breed or it's not treated this way. We don't want to have to think too much about our relationship with our dogs. We want to believe that our anthropomorphic perception of them will somehow outweigh their inherent survival skills. In the year of our Lord Cthulhu, 2025, pit bulls are in a more complex situation than they've ever been. And I don't want to pretend like things haven't gotten better because they undeniably have. Pit bulls' perception is better than it's been since the 1940s. There have been a ton of new pit bull rescues and pit bull advocates pop up. They're back to their glory days in Hollywood, especially with movies like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. More and more studies have come out to support them and support that they exist within normal parameters of dogs. And a lot of people have changed their mind just because they saw one on TikTok and went, hey, that's cute. But this is still a very tenacious argument. Like I said, there are still people who have built entire careers on trying to get these dogs banned, and many countries and landlords still won't let you have them. And insurance companies still have set ridiculous standards and premiums for pit bulls. And look, I honestly don't care if you like pit bulls. I'm not one of these people who's like, oh, you just gotta meet the right one. Like, if you met my pit bulls, you would love them. For some people, pit bulls just aren't their thing. I get it. I don't like horses. I don't really know why. I think it's the cold, dead eyes. Something about it just weirds me out. I don't mind if people don't care for or even hate my dogs. Where I get frustrated is when people try or succeed at passing legislation to ban them. Because one, yeah, it affects me directly, and two, it doesn't work. Ireland banned 11 different dog breeds in 1998, and since then, dog bites have gone up drastically. And that's even accounting for a rise in population. When Toronto banned pit bull type dogs in 2005, the same thing happened. Many countries, states, and local governments are repealing breed-specific legislations because when they enact them, they either don't change dog bites or dog bites actually go up. Even when breed-specific legislation is enacted and dog bites go down, it's usually because people with those dogs move. And then as more people come in, the dog bites go right back up and stagnate. Because when you ban specific breeds, the amount of bites don't change. What changes is which dogs are doing the biting. This is why the CDC, the American Veterinary Medical Association, the Humane Society, the National Canine Research Council, and too many other organizations to name have disavowed breed-specific legislation. If we want to limit dog attacks, if that's our goal, which I think for most people it is, the answer is not banning specific dogs. The answer is enacting legislation and making moves that actually work to prevent bites. This means holding individual dog owners more responsible for their specific dogs, not leaving kids unattended, yes, better understanding dogs' body language and reevaluating our relationship with dogs, and remembering that dogs are animals and sometimes animals make mistakes. I think at the end of the day, the story of pit bulls says way more about us than it does the dogs themselves. We like simple answers, and we like stories, and we like things that make us feel, even if that feeling is abject terror. But just like many other things we find ourselves afraid of, whether it be some animals or even other humans, if we take time to educate ourselves and reevaluate our biases and re-examine our place in the world, things aren't as scary as we make them out to be or as other people try to make them out to be. Damn. I think this was probably the definitive video about pit bulls. I think I covered every single possible argument and study, so you now have all the answers. You're welcome.